Mama.
Spooky noises.
Get inside my head. No, it's my Freddie Mercury.
Oh, that's good. Liked it.
Man. I love Queen.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love Freddie Mercury?
I don't know. Sometimes I feel so bad for Jake. because he has to edit this in a way.
Leave it in, Jake. Leave it in. Leave this all in. It all stays in.
Jake, leave it all in.
Leave it all in.
It all stays in. It always all stays in.
Inside my hand. I never meant to him.
Poor Jake. Poor Jake. All right. Jake, roll the tape.
Welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. This week's episode, Alien Odyssey Part 1.
Chapter 2. How It All Began. Phyllis's strange behavior after I met her started in a serious way in September 1986. It began in her sleep. Without waking, she took off her nightgown, wadded it into a ball, and threw it across the room. Then she remained peacefully under the covers until daylight. Upon awakening, she was mystified about what had happened to her nightgown. Subsequently, she found it under a bureau on the other side of the room. It was disturbing. She didn't even recall being restless. The next night it happened again. This time it was on the radiator. On the third night, she began talking in her sleep. As the nights progressed, her talking changed from incoherent mumbling to clear sentences. Throwing the nightgowns continued for another week. I began asking her questions. Her responses no longer sounded like ordinary sleep talk because they were too clear in pronunciation and meaning. Every morning she recalled nothing of the conversations. She didn't believe me when I told her about them, but she was still mystified about the nightgowns. Finally, I bought a tape recorder and began recording the nightly conversations. We made our first tape on September 22nd. And so begins, at least after the first chapter, The Alien Odyssey, a true story by John M. Meloney. The book that we are going to be talking about tonight on the Mad Scientist Podcast. All right. I don't know what that noise was, Marie.
I was just saying, I didn't know if you were going to introduce us.
Well, I'm Chris Cogswell, and this is my co-host, Marie Mayhew.
Forget it. It's moot now. Let's move on.
We'll move on.
Just teasing. I actually was reading ahead a little bit when I said I was reading on some of my favorite chapters of this book. And crazy thing about this book is, like, every time I read it, like, every time I pick it up, I consciously try and dismiss it. And I'm, whether it's kind of the wacky cover or the self-publication genre feel of it. And then I just start to read it, and then I just sort of get sucked in a little bit. And then it's like, I'm like 3 chapters along, and I'm starting to, every time I read it, I buy into it more.
It's interesting, right? It's one of those books that,
yeah.
It's one of those books that it does not have a great looking cover.
Yes.
So to begin with, let's kind of introduce this book.
Yes.
So this is a book by Mr. John M. Meloney of Claremont, New Hampshire. And as we're going to find out in telling the story of, I don't know if there's a city in America this man hasn't lived in. Based on his life. He led an amazing life, honestly. This is how he describes himself. John M. Meloney, retired former journalist and UFO investigator for NICAP, has written an astounding account of his true life experiences married to a woman who channeled aliens.
Yeah.
That's just the beginning of his introduction to himself. And actually, if you look at some of the other interviews with, or his book was reviewed and things like that. So this is a review, Alien Odyssey by John Meloney, review by Mac Tonys. So, quote, Meloney's self-published memoir is a succinct look at alleged channeled alien communications as experienced by Meloney and his late wife. Within a field that has been relentlessly marginalized by the mainstream scientific establishment, the implications of channeling have been neatly brushed aside by the ufological community. Thus, commentary on perceived channeled communications are generally dismissed more vigorously than the numerous contact details of the likes of George Adamski and Daniel Fry. Meloney's Alien Odyssey offers us a personal glimpse of the phenomena that, while shedding no real insight on his reality, reveals its human dynamic with evident sincerity. I think that is the best review of a book I've ever read. Honestly, it perfectly captures both the problem with this book and the reason why you've never heard of John Meloney as a listener.
Yes.
Even those of you who have a significant interest in the UFO field have likely never heard of this man, even though he was involved in the founding of NICAP. He was there for the beginnings of MUFON practically. He was one of the first people doing real investigations of these phenomena, of these cases. And yet, because of his experiences later on in his life, he was marginalized, I would argue. His view, his voice was kind of pushed to the back burner to the point that he had to self-publish this book.
Yes.
You know?
I think what's interesting about this that probably happens in any science field is there are pet theories or more commonly held theories and beliefs, and everything else that doesn't fit into that narrative for a given point of time takes a backseat in the bus, right? And some of them
Absolutely.
are still totally, I don't want to say legit, but are viewed with credulity. And then the further back you get, the further away you are from being seen as a serious contender and someone who's got a serious voice on the subject. And it's interesting to take something like the study of UFOs, which is now coming more into the forefront with sciences, but seeing, again, like to your point, this man who has dedicated his life to it, who has documented things in a really pretty clear way, and obviously had a lot of passion around the subject, sort of be dismissed, systematically dismissed.
No, I mean, not sort of be dismissed. He was.
Very much so.
We're going to get into it. We're going to get into my own attempt to learn more about this person and his work and the case itself, really.
Yeah.
And his involvement with UFO groups. But the fascinating thing for me with this is that his view, this book was published in 2002. The stories that he's talking about occurred in the 80s to the late 90s, around there, until his wife Phyllis unfortunately passed away. His second wife Phyllis, his first wife Virginia, and him separated earlier in their lives. But at the time, around 2002, and even really up until, I would say a couple of years ago, the view of UFOs or alien contact as a non-physical phenomena, as something like a skinwalker type thing that we think about today, that was taboo even within the UFO community. If it didn't have an engine and metal doors, people didn't want to hear about it.
Yes.
The serious investigators did not touch those cases. And it has changed with the publication of Hunt for the Skinwalker. It has changed with the internet, with people getting more information on these cases. And it's also changed with the increased reliance and acceptance of contactee reports. And so the blurring of the lines between if they're able to come into your bedroom at night, seemingly, and phase through walls and whatever, stop time, all these other weird things supposedly that they can do, then where do you draw that line? What becomes impossible? You know?
Yeah.
And that is really where I think this book is so fascinating, is that this is an untold UFO story. It is an untold alien contact account. I guarantee you've never heard of it unless you have a copy of this book, or I have cornered you in a bar, much to your chagrin. This is a brand new story. So I'm so excited, Marie. I can't wait to tell this story. I'm so excited.
I know you are. I think this is awesome.
Okay, so
getting this blacklisted from every UFOlogy forum out there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we
run us out. They run us out of town on a rail.
They blacklisted us. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Marie.
Yes.
Let's start this story off with how it came to our attention.
Yes.
Really, how it came to my attention first.
Yes.
And then how I introduced it to you and Scott and Forrest and Tess.
Yeah.
one faithful night. So this story is actually originally, it's set in the later part of the story, it's set in Claremont, New Hampshire, a small town in New Hampshire in the Connecticut River Valley that, honestly, I absolutely love.
Mm-hmm.
Claremont, New Hampshire is a small city. It's a city. It became a city in 1947 and actually officially got that title for itself. Before that, it was a town originally settled in 1762, incorporated as a town in 1764. The area has always been settled as far as we can tell from archaeological information, at least as long as peoples have been in this part of America. Originally, it was part of the area controlled by the Algonquin tribes. Initially, the Pennacook and Abenaki peoples had it until the Algonquin came and they kind of merged together. And the area is very popular has always been popular because it's on the Connecticut River. The Connecticut River travels all the way from Canada all the way down to Connecticut and down into the Atlantic Ocean. So it is a very important water thoroughfare if you want to get to this part of the country.
Yeah.
Because of that, it's always been, it's very early settled for America, settled in 1764. It rather settled in 1762, but still really brought initially as an area for farming, for milling, for industry, for water industry, right?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a mill town.
It is 100% a mill town.
So many in Connecticut and New Hampshire, Vermont. It's a mill town.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. The city actually became very wealthy during around the late 20th century. The city was very, very wealthy. It had rivers that were very, mobile. They're very fast moving rivers. So there's a lot of energy there to harness for mill work and things like that. And it stayed prosperous until really around the 1930s, 1940s, like so many other mill towns.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the jobs really started to go away. And then Claremont kind of held on until around the 70s or 80s. And eventually that was when the last of the big companies that were using kind of mill work and textile manufacturing, that was right around the time that company closed its doors, and the city or the town, city, whatever you want to call it, has really never been the same since that day.
Yeah. All of its infrastructure and commerce was driven by that. That's sad.
Absolutely. Now, Claremont is, like I said, it's a small city. It has a population of around 14,000 people. It has a population density of 300 people per square mile. So it's relatively populous, but still quite rugged. And there's a lot of areas I can attest personally, a lot of areas of Claremont that are just forest.
That you can spread
untouched
out.
Forest. You absolutely can spread out.
Do you know, really quickly, can I just do a quick tangent?
Sure.
Do you know what made me think of Claremont in a movie that I was watching recently? What? Hereditary. I don't know if, I think it was supposed to be more like, I want to say like Utah, but it felt like upstate New York when I first started to watch it. And then when they did the treehouse, I was like, well, we're in Chris's book.
Pretty much, yeah. I was pretty sure that it was in the upper Midwest because they mention the use of the West for something. I'm not going to spoil the story, Marie.
Don't spoil the story. No, but I just, I don't know where and of course, that was my last, rational thought with that movie. I was like, oh, this sort of reminds me, oh my God, anyways, but that's sort of the same feel. It feels very, Claremont it is rural. I mean, it's, you may not have neighbors too very close. You've got a lot of land. It stays in the family for generations, right? Your local constable, your local sheriff. It's seemingly from all the stories and from what we've read and from what I've heard, it seems very close-knit.
Yeah, it definitely is. Now, I originally found out about Claremont, was introduced to Claremont because of my wife, Katie, who at the time was my girlfriend. We went up there for Christmas, the second Christmas I think that we spent as a couple. Katie's family invited me up with them to Claremont, New Hampshire, to the farm, really the farm. It is land that is zoned for farmland, but has not been used for farmland for quite some time. But basically the big, beautiful cabin that Katie's grandma and grandpa owned and lived in.
Oh, the farm. Like, really quick, were you like, the farm? You're all Staten Island, you're like, farm. I got up some farm.
The most rural I had ever been to before that was the Poconos in Pennsylvania. Where, there was a pizza place down the road owned by a guy who lived in New York most of the time. So like I didn't exactly go very far. We had a Super Nintendo in the lodge. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't not exactly rugging it or whatever. But so this town it's beautiful. I fell in love with it the minute we went up there. But when we went up there though, we're same stuff, sitting around the fire, talking about old family stories and all that stuff. And Katie's grandma and the family are like, oh, Chris is into UFOs and weird stuff. Tell him about the alien guy down the hill. And so I was given this amazing story about this guy who lived down the hill. I think he was still alive at the time, who wrote this wacky book talking about how his wife telepathically communicate with aliens, and they had to go across the country basically averting alien disaster and trying to teach these aliens human customs and how to communicate when channeling. And it is just a super interesting story. And
it's super interesting to me that that's like one of your first interactions with her family. And they were like, so what are we going to talk to Katie's new boyfriend about? Oh, he likes aliens.
Yeah,
Nana, tell him the alien story.
It's so interesting. And
I love that.
So I was given this book, and I actually had read it earlier before, but when I was starting this podcast, Katie's grandma actually sent me the book again. I asked her to, and she sent me it with this note in it. So the note goes, Chris, hope this has enough material for a podcast episode. Seems to me he started out quite a normal person, with some unusual adventure related to World War II, and from there gradually spins out until by the end, the addendum, he is obviously overtaken by aliens in a post-life regression episode, in true La La Land. Oh well, have fun. Looking forward to the result. Best, Grandma. Extremely cute, an extremely sweet thing that she sent it to me at my request.
So cute.
Okay, so here's where stuff starts to get interesting from my personal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I started living at Katie's grandma's cabin in Claremont for about a year and a half. Katie got into vet school here in Minnesota. I was still finishing up my PhD in New Hampshire, or in Massachusetts rather, in Boston, Northeastern. And I needed someplace to live for cheap and store all my stuff, because we weren't going to move all my stuff over there yet, because I needed most of my stuff. And Katie's grandma's house was like the obvious choice, So I moved
2 hours away from Boston.
2 hours away from Boston.
It's free. It's obvious.
It was free. I was mostly writing my thesis. It was a no-brainer. And honestly, I love the area. I love the house. Was so excited to live there for a little bit. So lived there for a year and a half, like I said. And during that year and a half is when I got involved in the Astonishing Research Corps. And when we really started talking about all this weird stuff. So
yes.
In doing that, I think the first email even I sent to Scott, I said, I'm living on land that supposedly is like a UFO hotspot.
And he's like, how did you get this email address?
Yeah, he's like, oh my God, another one. So what I found out living there, eventually it became, just in being interested in this stuff and wanting to learn more about it and everything else, I started looking into the book more and actually became friendly with the neighbor who lived down the hill from us, whose father actually built the home that Katie's grandma eventually bought. So they actually lived in that house originally. That was like their family home growing up. that his father had built by hand. You know, it's an amazing, amazing house, an amazing story. And so the guy would come up occasionally and talk to me, you know, whatever. And we talked about the podcast and talking about this weird book. And I asked him, you know, have you ever heard anything about this John M. Meloney guy? And he had heard of him. He knew of him from the town and everything. He knew he was a bit of an eccentric, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
He then, he gets a copy of the book because now he's delighted that this book exists.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he comes over one day, super excited, with a part of the book highlighted. The part that's highlighted is this, quote, "There was a case in Claremont where several people who did not know each other all reported a craft passing low below the top of Green Mountain on the north side of town and hovering nearly an hour over a field on the east side of the mountain. The sighting took place about 1 a.m. and was reported to the local police department. We interviewed all of the witnesses, each of whom assumed they were the only ones who saw it," end quote. That was exciting and fascinating for the neighbor because the only thing that he could remember being a kid living on that land that seemed a little odd was his father one morning saying that he had seen a UFO in the field. That he had seen something hovering for about an hour. He watched it hovering there around the field, seeming like it was looking for something.
For an hour.
Yeah. And this is before, you know, people had access to cameras and things, right?
Yeah.
And this guy was floored that this case, and let me be straight too. Green Mountain, where this is, he says below the top of Green Mountain. Green Mountain is the mountain that I lived on. He's describing a craft that the neighbor down the hill, my neighbor, his father saw, always said that he saw everything else.
For an hour hanging out in proximity to where you were living.
And actually, we lived on the other side of Green Mountain. So this is this thing was there for some time, for an hour or more.
Man.
Now,
maybe it was looking for cows.
Now, looking into more detail, this is actually noted in a case for NICAP. So, quote, 1968, Claremont, New Hampshire, dome-shaped object hovers 10 foot above ground. Early on the morning of July 30th, 1968, a couple, names on file at NICAP, finished working on their new house in the Roberts Hill district of Claremont, New Hampshire, and were preparing to retire. Some lights in the field back of the house, apparently about 200 feet away, attracted their attention and they went to the window to see what was going on. To their astonishment, they saw a dome-shaped object hovering about 10 feet off the ground. The underside of the object was illuminated, and the light covered an area about 20 feet in diameter on the ground. Since they were in a fairly isolated area with no telephone, they had just moved into the house, the couple became frightened. They could hear a buzzing sound like a transformer coming from the object. The time was about 2:30 a.m. Mr. and Mrs. John Meloney of the New Hampshire NICAP subcommittee investigated the report in close cooperation with the Claremont police. In their interview with the couple, they learned that the UFO had remained over the field until about 4:30 a.m. Then the humming became very loud, the light grew to a high intensity, and the UFO moved away at a low angle upward to the west and disappeared. In the garage, the family dog whined loudly as the UFO departed. 2 separate groups of witnesses have been located by the subcommittee. The report seems to indicate beyond a reasonable doubt that something unexplained was in the area, end quote. Now here's the thing. That does not include my neighbor's father's recollection.
So that's separate from.
They
in
mentioned,
addition to.
No, this is the same case, but they mentioned 2 separate groups of witnesses.
Oh, yeah.
This is a third witness.
Who was the other witness? Did you find out?
I don't know. The names are on file at NICAP, but you know, personal identifying information has to be protected, all that stuff.
Right. What's interesting about that to me is that Meloney had cooperation from the police. And
100%.
seemingly like he gathered a sizable amount of information on it with some credibility behind it. I also find it interesting, again, if I may just interject with this, that you, again, it's like some Stephen King short story that you're up there in fall wearing, what I imagine like plaid flannel, jackets, stomping around this, kind of quiet, very rural area. And it's an alien hotspot. And you're doing all this research into Skinwalker and stuff, dude. And then your neighbor's like, oh yeah, by the way.
Yeah. Now this is not
so weird.
This isn't even the best. This is by far not the best case that he investigated. He investigated others that had physical witness or physical evidence, I should say.
This is the one in your backyard.
Burn marks, radiation burns, things like that. So his contribution to UFO history is significant.
Yeah.
But you've never heard of him.
No. And the thing that dawned on me is the movie Communion with Christopher Walken came out in I want to say 86, 87. And it was a huge deal. Right. And so it was sort of like, that's the same time, sort of within the same window that a lot of his stuff was happening with him, but he received none of the same coverage or none of the same. It's nothing even equivalent to it.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing with this story.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of UFO history that's known as I hesitate to call it a flap. It's like the golden age of UFO cases.
The golden era.
These all occurred in the early 60s to late 70s, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
The stories that he talks about in his book happened after that, of course, with Phyllis. However, this is all a part of the Mothman story, really. It's part of the overarching story that John Keel tells in the Mothman Prophecies, the book, not necessarily in the movie, although the movie's amazing.
Richard Gere.
Come on, Marie.
It's all right.
The book itself talks about how at this time...
He's no Christopher Walken.
That's true. He's no Christopher Walken. It's fine. We're gonna move past it, Marie. It's okay. Marie's husband has a thing against Richard Gere.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. He's not the biggest fan, but you want to get Christopher Walken, man. Find me somebody who doesn't like Christopher Walken.
That's true. That'd be hard to find.
No.
All these things tie together into the contactee phenomena where, and John Keel talks about this in Mothman Prophecies, that UFO contactees were getting telepathic communications supposedly from aliens, some of which or aliens, entities, intelligences, whatever you want to call them, some of which use the same name, some of which said the same information, some of which gave information to people who had never met, who never could have met, lived across the country from each other, gave them the same name. We're from this planet. We're this many light years away. We're here to warn you about this, whatever. And in some cases, a skeptic like myself can discount those things. I mean, okay, yeah, you're a million light years away. Okay, I'm sure you are. I mean, everyone would jump to a number like that, a nice round number. People will give names of things that they think aliens, Klaxar, Zeborp, whatever, right? And
Zeborp?
I don't know, but you know what I'm saying.
No, I like where you're going with this.
And if you asked 10 people to give what kind of message do you think an alien would tell us? 9 out of 10 people are going to say something like, stop trying to kill each other. Stop trying to nuke yourselves. We come in peace.
Save the planet.
Save the planet. Crap like that.
Mm-hmm.
Stupid liberal tree hugger crap like that, Marie.
Tree hugging.
And so
West Coast elites.
But when an alien or when an entity, an intelligence seems to say to 15 different people who have never met that their name is a Paul and they're from the planet, I don't even know, Zinkar 7 or something weird, whatever, right?
Zinkar
something specific.
Yes.
It either begins to look like a long-ranging conspiracy where all these people are lying to John Keel, or they're all being given information, or something real is happening, something really unexplained, or John Keel is lying and making it all up. This book is a part of the, I'm sorry, I just want to finish this point because I think it's important.
Go ahead.
This book is as silly as it is presented, as terrible as the cover is, as just, I don't know, positively, or I guess
cheesy,
the drawing on the cover is, as all of that is true, this book is, I think, actually very important for the UFO field, because it tells a part of this story. It's part of the story coming from the word of mouth, coming from a real person who had these experiences with his wife, who believed it enough to spend his life doing it. And a person who, you're going to find out, had a very interesting life that he will underplay in this book. But I mean, this guy was basically he was basically 007. It's amazing.
He was, but here's my question. From John Keel's Mothman Prophecies to this book, are you saying that there are similarities in what the quote-unquote aliens were telling them both?
I'm saying that there are, this book talks about motifs and ideas and methods and things like that are now considered almost accepted common knowledge in the UFO field.
Canon.
And they have become canon because of books like John Keel's. And because of people who talked about, you know, the non-physical reality of these things and all this weird kind of stuff and whatever. I'm saying that I think this is a guy who helped build this field up, and I think has been ostracized unfairly. I'm not saying anything about the reality of the book itself. For as far as I'm concerned, this guy was just having a great time at a McDonald's with his wife. You're gonna hear, dear listeners, like 50% of this book happens in a McDonald's.
McDonald's parking lot.
They loved McDonald's.
Well, but again, during the time, if you think about this, because here's another point. Highways, especially during the 60s and 70s, were just becoming more heavily traversed. What's on those highways? That's, you know, mom and pop eateries are now gone. Fast food. So I don't doubt that, you know, that the places that they're going to eat the most in all of their illustrative travel would probably be a fast food place. Like McDonald's.
For sure. So let's get into this. Let's get into it, Marie. Okay. So we're going to start here by telling the story of John Meloney. And we're then going to bring in the other characters here. The story really chronicles John Meloney and his wife, Phyllis, communicating with a host of different aliens. They actually give a list of the names of the aliens here in the back of the book. Let's go through some of them, actually. That might be kind of fun. So we have Aiken, Agel, Aguilta, Adida, Amgrat, Androd. Actually, Androd is one that does come up in Keel's book, I believe.
Oh, really?
Atra, same thing, one that I think comes up. Drendy, Dolia, Deponi, Gidia, Gazal.
Dolia's big.
Jalbit, Jopit, Coda, Mieta, Miss, Nefo. They're all from the planet Pochi, or a lot of them are from the planet Pochi, which is interesting. You got Tug, you got Toke Aju, you got Temamet, you got Techi, you got Otto, Anzik, Oiken, Octa, Noto. I like Otto. Otto is the best one.
Otto's a female.
They might have just been getting Otto through the radio. So,
dear. No, I mean, but again, like, I look at these names of aliens and I sort of, you know, I don't dismiss out of hand. It's like, let's, for the sake of argument, say these things are true, right? Like, let's say that they were in communication with some foreign entity and that entity had to have some sort of identifier so they knew what to call him, right? Or
sure,
call
yeah,
her.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, what else would that, to me, it's like the alien would, you know, drop back and punt in a lot of ways and be like, I've got to come up with some nonsensical thing to tell them that that's what I mean, even if their mind couldn't comprehend what my actual identity is.
It just happened to land on one real name.
how is
Otto.
Beto? Yeah, how is Beto or Ga or Ideen or any of these other things any more different than like Chris or Marie or anything like that?
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm with you there. Here's the other part of this too. I think it's important to say this right off the bat. This story is gonna get funny and weird. This story is ridiculous in many ways, but this guy John Meloney and his wife Phyllis, and even his first wife Virginia, they played an important part in the history of UFOs, a part that you've never heard before. And honestly, I have a lot of love for these characters. I have a lot of love for this guy reading this book. He is a sweet, sincere man. He really loved his wife, and they had an amazing time in their later years traveling around the country looking for alien hotspots. It's like the honeymoon I've always wanted. Right?
Except Katie's like, no,
Katie's in the room like, shut up. I don't want to make it seem like we're making fun of him or we're this is a funny story. UFO stories often are funny. It just comes with the territory.
Well, and if you look at it through the lens of what that time was, right? So this was written in 2000s about an earlier time period in the 80s. I feel like anytime you're looking back or anytime even now you're looking even further back, there's a certain amount of pastiche with it, right? Like we were saying, they eat it. Yeah. They eat a lot of McDonald's. A lot of sort of what their descriptors are a little are sort of strange and are not exactly like heavy literary references, or you're not, again, you're not reading, this isn't, it's not like that type of engagement. But when you look at sort of the facts and the consistency of what he's saying, I think that's what's the underlying structure.
100%. No, I'm with you there.
Yeah, and that's what I think is kind of more interesting. If you strip away everything else, I think that's what's most interesting.
Okay, so
yes.
John Meloney, initially born to a small family, he actually had a younger sister, although not a lot is mentioned about her in the book. And when they were kids, they really moved around a lot. The father, it doesn't actually say, and I couldn't find what the father did, other than that he was a, quote, executive. So
there we go. Yeah.
Kind of like an old school, what'd your dad do? Business? Okay.
Sort of Mad Men-esque kind of feel to him.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's an executive of some sort, so he moved around a lot.
Continental, yeah.
Moved around a lot. But his area of moving around seemed to center on New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, right? He lived in the New England area. So he finally got some stability in his life. He attended the New Hampton School for Boys in New Hampton, New Hampshire. He did that before college. Seemed to do fine there. There's not really a lot of, not a lot of information out there about his time there. And then eventually he graduated. He moved on to Cornell University. At the time, the College of Agriculture was free. This is pre-World War II. And so it was free if you lived in New York State or were born in New York, something of that sort. So because they had a New York residence, he was able to attend for free. Although in the summers, to attend for free, you had to do farm work. So he talks about, he did farm work in Oregon. He did some farm work in the South. It just sounds kind of cool. It sounds like the kind of thing I would love to do.
Well, yeah, Cornell.
Besides,
do they still offer that program? Nuh-uh.
No, of course not.
Nuh-uh.
So in the middle of his studies, though, he was upended. His class was upended by World War II occurring. And so he went to Cornell until World War II, at which time he decided to join up with the Army. He was drafted. And so he actually volunteered for the ski troopers initially. Now, Marie, we were talking about this off air. You said you didn't know about the ski troopers.
Well, it's not exactly one of the first things that you would think about, when you think about World War II in so far as military actions and big military history, and what happened in World War II is not like, oh, and then, the 103rd Ski Battalion came in and, it's like you don't hear those stories. And so when he opted in for the ski patrol. I was like, what? That's kind of like, that's just strange, right? You hear about Normandy. You hear about like storming the beaches of Normandy, but you don't really hear about like anything snowy with skis.
See, I knew about the ski troopers because of they were actually really important in the resistance of Scandinavian countries against the Nazis. And actually, I think in particular, Finland, I want to say, had some very famous ski troopers. I think there was a sniper who was a ski trooper who like killed something like, I don't remember if this is, I should have looked this up before we recorded. There's some guy who killed like 300 Nazis or something because he was a sniper and he skied around and just was like the skier of death.
Dude.
So
that's a Tarantino film in the making.
I know, it's so amazing. So anyway, so ski troopers, so he originally just tried to become a ski trooper. Instead, he was found to have had an aptitude for language. And so he actually was trained in German, in Swedish, in kind of the culture, the languages, things like that, so that he could pass as a Swedish national if the Germans tried to invade Sweden. So his role initially was going to be in a ski trooper thing, but eventually it morphed into him becoming actually a important part, or an potential important part in Swedish resistance against the Nazis, if the Nazis ever took over Sweden.
Wow, and like an intelligence too.
Yeah, so he
Crazy.
Actually it moved over to become an intelligence service job with the OSS. Now, for those of you that don't know, the OSS is kind of the beginnings of the CIA. So it's the Office of Strategic Services. It was basically a spy organization meant to conduct espionage and get information, and to have soldiers in these areas that were controlled by the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And so his job within the OSS was actually to be both a spy, but also a decoder. So his job was supposed to be transporting messages from Sweden and from from these Scandinavian countries about German movements and German information, things like that, and then transferring that over to the Allied High Command. So this is actually Meloney talking about his time there. Quote, he says, quote, "My primary job was to spy on England. Even though she was an ally, America wanted to know what she was up to during her occupation of Norway. We could send messages back to our base in London every other hour. I would code the messages and give them to the radio operator, who would transmit them by Morse code to England. But the British were over on the other side of town with their spy operation, and on the same radio frequency we were sending on. They would hold down the teletype key to disrupt our messages to London because they knew we were spying on them. The following hour, the British would send their messages back to their base in London. We'd do the same thing. Hold down the key to screw them up," Meloney said with a smile. "Then that night, we'd all get together and have a big party. We were all big buddies." End quote.
War.
Isn't that amazing?
That's so crazy. Well, first of all, it's insane that you have an ally in a neutral country spying on another ally.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm sure it happens. Of course it happens, but it's strange to hear about it, especially when there's so much else going on. But they were just spying, and then they wouldn't let them communicate. That's also good. And then they'd all get together and just get drunk and destroy.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Now, he then actually stayed after the war. So after the war ended, here's another quote about him that he had at the time. And actually, all this information is coming from DonMooreWarTales.com, which is a really, really fascinating website. I'm really happy to give them a shout out. I think it's really a very, very cool website about kind of war and the people that fought in them. So this is a quote. So this is a quote from the website. "World War II was over, but not for Sergeant John Meloney. He was on his way from Oslo, Norway to London, where he held a quick meeting with his OSS handlers, and off he flew to Salzburg, Austria." So this is a quote from John. Quote, I found the OSS office in a Catholic monastery in Salzburg. The Allies had already chopped Austria into 4 sections, occupied by the American, English, Russian, and French. Lots was going on over there. It was my job to spy on England, Russia, and the Vatican. Primarily, we were handling the refugee problem. There were a lot of Jewish refugees coming out of Russian-occupied Czechoslovakia and Poland. We would send them down to Italy, and they would go by boat to Palestine. We were also on the lookout for German rocket scientists. These were the people we sent to the United States because they had all kinds of valuable intelligence about rocket building. We had a safe house in Salzburg where we hid rocket scientists. I remember one night we had a couple of scientists in the house who wandered outside and got taken by somebody were captured by Russian spies who wanted to kidnap them. Immediately, word went out to our agents all over the city that the Russians had captured the scientists. Before the night was over, we got them back. The 2 German rocket experts were delirious. We sent agents into the Vatican. The Vatican was a very powerful international political voice. We sent a Catholic and Protestant spy to check out the Vatican. We would compare the reports of our 2 spies and write a consolidated report on what they learned. The Vatican was involved in all kinds of things. Some of the top Nazi prisoners escaped to South America after the war with the Vatican's help, he said. By the time I got back home in 1946, I didn't know what country to be loyal to. I didn't want to be loyal to any country. I just wanted world peace. End quote. This guy lived an awesome life.
Wow. Well, I mean, saying that the Vatican helped Nazis too. That's, still relatively incendiary to say that.
Yeah,
right? And to put that out there.
But also relatively spot on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not doubting. I am not doubting.
Ridiculous. So, interestingly, he comes back from the war. He is very disillusioned. He's not interested in being part of any one country anymore. And so he becomes, I hesitate to say that he became a pacifist. He more became, I guess, for lack of a better term, he became a proponent of the New World Order. And I don't mean that in the ridiculous conspiracy way. I mean that literally he believed in a larger world government like the United Nations that would impose Earth law, basically, and uphold standards of human activity, I guess.
Well, he's probably so disillusioned with every single government and every single faction that he's working with, no matter what language they're speaking. They're all sort of not helping any kind of greater good, which is sort of the reality of war, right? I mean, nobody comes out of war or goes into war as the quote unquote right side, or it's like it's just a messy, awful, and probably very disillusioning place to be, especially World War II, especially, trying to get prisoners of war, Jewish prisoners of war and concentration camp victims out of Russia or out of wherever back into some nation state. That's insane.
Well, also,
and would be hard.
I mean, you see the horrors of war firsthand, and you see too. I mean, his job was specifically spying on allies. Spying on our friends. So it's clear. I think it would be clear to anyone working in that kind of field that the idea of nations being friendly, like peace, is just prolonged stalemate. It's not there is no peace really if there are nations, because eventually it's gonna have to happen. Eventually it happens. It doesn't have to happen, but eventually it'll happen. I think there's a famous quote that war is the only option when all economic means have been exhausted. Something like that. Anyways,
I think you made that one up.
I did
I think on an earlier episode.
Oh, maybe I did. I'm just that great, Marie.
I'm just saying. No, but I think but that's interesting. And then again, sort of you see this correlation back to his interest in something that's other than human, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and let's pretend you don't believe in aliens, just for the sake of stepping back and looking at this as almost like a pop psychology view of it. It's like you can see, well, this man had such a disillusioned view of humanity and what we do to one another that, of course, he would be looking for something that would answer that.
Right, you'd be looking for another civilization.
Yeah, he'd be looking for the higher calling that is not religious, because he just was also, watching the Vatican.
Sure, yeah. I don't want to live on this planet anymore.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
So he actually then he comes back to the United States. He attends a couple of colleges in various things. I actually don't think, I think he eventually did graduate, but I'm not sure in what. It's not really made super duper clear in the book. But anyways, he eventually joins a small group at the time called the World Federalist Movement, or the World Federal Government is what it's called then. The group itself is basically a citizens movement that advocates a global federal system of democratic global institutions. So the idea is that the entire world would get together and create a democracy that would govern the entire world. The movement itself started in 1947, but really got its start in a meeting at Montreux, okay, which is in Switzerland. It is at this meeting that John Meloney actually got to attend. He actually was there for the beginnings of this group. He was there in the second meeting of August 1947 in Montreux. 51 organizations from 24 countries came together at this conference that was known as the Conference of the World Movement for World Federal Government. And it ended up concluding with what's known as the Montreux Doctrine, or Montreux Declaration, which basically just states, the principles of world federal government. Okay, so he actually moved there. He moved to Sweden. It was at the University of Stockholm as part of this American, basically an American college within the University of Stockholm. He was actually the student body president there, supposedly, and was allowed to kind of go to formal meetings with, the ambassador to Sweden and all kinds of other stuff. And acted as something of an American representative in Sweden. So him going to this conference was something of a big deal. And that declaration actually made its way to the UN. And the next year, this group had 150,000 members. That is intense.
That, for something that I don't know anything about now, the world federal government. I mean, that's a little again, sort of semi-incendiary.
Absolutely.
Right?
So and basically for the rest of his life, he was part of political action groups, push groups, stuff like this, specifically looking for world federal government to promote democratic ideals across all nations, stuff like that. It is fascinating, though. He finally returns to the United States after Sweden, after doing all this stuff, finishes college, comes back to the United States, and his family unfortunately is broken apart. His parents have divorced, so he moves to Florida with his mother and sister to be near them. And he ends up becoming a journalist, and this is really where he starts his career and how he becomes interested in UFOs. He is a reporter in Florida for a short period of time. He then moves to Binghamton, New York. And in Binghamton, he meets his first wife, Virginia. All right. Now, Virginia, if John Meloney is an awesome dude, Virginia is an awesome lady. Okay? She was a pilot in the Women's Air Force Service, or which was known as the WASPs. Okay? She basically was one of the air pilots that would transport or help to ferry bombers and things from airport to airport during the war.
Yeah, where women were not flying. Women were not pilots in World War II.
No. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's super cool to have her. It's super cool that she actually had this job. And she ended up getting, Do you remember what they say exactly, Marie? It's something like she had like a 4-engine license or something.
Oh my God.
Basically, it meant that she could fly every type of aircraft. That she had experienced, she had enough hours to fly every type of aircraft available at the time.
That's crazy.
So she also had this time in the war. She had this time in the Air Force was there even an Air Force at that time?
Mm-hmm.
But she was a pilot during the war. She ended up coming back again, same as John, disenchanted, did not think war was the answer anymore, and started to basically be part of these same push groups. So John and Virginia get married. They then moved to Alaska. She was a airline dispatcher at the time. He, because it is, the 1950s and this is the way America worked, I guess, at the time, he just decided to buy a business in Alaska and made a living that way because that was possible. He didn't have to, no LinkedIn for him. So, like, and in the book, he just, like, every town he goes to, he's like, maybe I'll be a pizza guy in this town. He just buys a pizzeria and he does it.
Well, and again, the lens that we're looking at this in it is subjective. I mean, are these details really relevant or very important? I think the thing that it shows is that they had this relatively kind of a revolutionary worldview that was very different from being even the counterculture at the time, right? Like federal world government is very different than what was the counterculture.
No,
tune in, turn on, drop out.
In some ways,
even more fringe.
Yeah, in some ways, these guys are like these are the people that the hippies are like. Those guys are weird.
These guys are
right.
Crazy,
it's
right?
awesome.
Yeah.
It is so cool, Marie.
And they're picking up and they're moving and they're clearly they don't have a sedimentary lifestyle. They have whatever it is that just allows you to do this, which clearly I have no idea about. So. No,
it's amazing. Okay, so they're in Alaska for a short period of time, maybe around 2 years, something like that. The timeline here gets really fuzzy. There is not a lot of information on this guy out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you were trying to research, I don't know, an uncle or something, right? It's not, there just isn't a lot out there about a non-famous person before Facebook and Instagram. So eventually, though, they go back to Claremont. And in Claremont, he becomes a reporter again. He is there for some time in Manchester and Claremont, writing for these different papers in the area. They get into a dispute there again because of his political views. And I don't think I mentioned this before. In Florida, initially, he got into a fight because he was very anti-racist. And that did not fly in Florida after World War II. At least in that part of Florida. And so he moved back up north to New England. But again, his views kind of got him in some trouble. So then he moved back down to Florida. I guess try his luck again the second time. And in Florida, it's where they have their first experience with UFOs. The sports reporter for the St. Petersburg Independent claims that he's flying over the Gulf of Mexico and something appears before him and follows his plane. And so Meloney and his wife are fascinated by this because they know this guy. They know he's a logical, smart person. They know that he's not someone to just make up a story. And clearly he's very affected by this. But neither of them really believe him, but they're interested. Their attention is brought to this idea of UFOs. And so, again, after a little bit of time, they move back to New Hampshire. And at this time, Meloney becomes a mutual funds and insurance salesman. So again, like the fifth job this guy has had in as many years practically. And at that time, there is a huge UFO case in Enfield, New Hampshire, which again causes him to become absolutely fascinated in UFOs. This is the one that really makes him, into it. This is the one that gets him.
Yes, and there's actually more on that actual case as well.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marie.
I was going to say it's relatively well documented. That's all I was going to say about it.
Oh, okay.
I have no documentation in front of me. I did do some research on it, though. But it's warrant of almost its own show.
It absolutely is. And we're going to talk about it more. But basically here, this is again from NICAP, and we're going to talk about it here. So, quote, January 15th, 1965, between Wilmot and Enfield, New Hampshire. At 10 p.m., a former Manchester newsman, Mr. Charles Nee Jr., was driving on Route 4A when the radio suddenly stopped, the lights on the car went out, and the engine quit. He lost control.
Classic alien.
He lost control of the car and pulled on the side of the road, and then heard a loud humming sound like a high-frequency electrical whine. He then opened the car door and stepped out. He looked up and saw a very bright light below the cloud cover at around 2,000 to 5,000 feet altitude, which looked about the size of a flashlight held at arm's length, pointed towards his face. It seemed to hover for a moment, and then it took off to the south, traveling very fast. As the light left and the whine died away, the car's lights and radio came on and the motor started. The whole thing lasted about 15 or 20 seconds. End quote. This story, Meloney hears about, and he is just absolutely, him and his wife are hooked. They are now forever into this case and into these stories about UFOs. So, what does Meloney do? What do you think, Marie?
Can we just say that I think it's amazing too? Like all of his stories, like the beautiful thing about that story is that's the story for any sort of alien anything.
It's like the perfect story, right?
It is. It's the archetype. If there's one canon story, it's you're driving the car very, very late, right? And then the electrical cutout. It's perfect. So I think it's almost tailor-made for somebody to be able to want to engage more into.
I mean, it is strikingly similar to the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yes.
Right? That happened
in
a few years.
In a very similar place.
A very similar location, very similar place. Okay. Meloney reads this story, becomes interested, and he decides, I'm going to go investigate. I want to get involved in this thing. I'm already traveling to Washington to sell some mutual funds and insurance. So he decides to stop in to the headquarters of what is known as NICAP.
Just a drop in.
Just a drop in. NICAP is known as the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. It was, I would argue, the largest UFO research group in the United States from the 50s to maybe around the 70s. And it is one of the foundational parts of the UFO mythos. And Meloney is talking to all of the biggest players. And that is where we are going to pick up next week on Alien Odyssey Part 2.
Excellent.
Whew, Marie.
I know.
I'm so happy to be telling the story.
I'm so excited that we're finally getting to tell the story. Because like you said, I think that there's, even though it's a little cheesy, there's so much to it that deserves attention and even more investigation too.
Here's the part.
It's interesting.
Here's the part that I think is so fascinating: is this is a guy who was a literal spy. He was a spy in World War II. He spoke multiple languages. He was there for the beginning of the UFO field. In my mind, this is the guy you want to be interested in this.
Well, and he had his own, I mean, basically he was in a splinter cell organization that was radicalized even further than the counterculture in the 60s.
Well, that's the part of the story.
Insane.
That's the part of the story that I think is, honestly, I think it's why he is viewed less reliably than other reporters in some ways, is that, yes, this story is going to doesn't sound wacky. It might sound kind of wacky at this point. It's getting wackier. Just wait. All right. We haven't even gotten to, the alien that needs the McDonald's parking lot because it's better reception or something. Like, we're not even at that level yet, but this is like this, to me, it is the perfect UFO story. This guy was a spy. He comes back disillusioned with war and finds aliens. It's amazing.
And he searches for them.
He does. He does, and he finds them.
And true love on top of everything else.
Oh my goodness, what true love.
I know.
Oh, at the heart At the heart of it, Marie, we're a romance podcast.
We really are. You know what? We love love. If you love love like we love love, you're going to love our podcast.
Surefire way to get people to turn it off. All right.
Exactly.
Thank you, listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell.
I'm Marie Mayhew.
She sure is Marie Mayhew. Now,
surely Marie Mayhew.
Marie.
Yeah.
We had something interesting to announce this episode.
What?
We had to mention who got the painting.
The haunted painting.
Who won the haunted painting?
I don't know. All I know is we got to get it out of my garage because it's trying to open a portal or something. It's sparking electricity. There's a vortex near it. You know, there's this black ichor ooze coming out of the back of the frame. I've been told, by Paul, I either have to donate it or clean it out, but he has to park the Prius in there and he doesn't want it near it.
Doesn't want it near it, huh, Marie?
It doesn't want it near the Prius. And I'm like, you know what? Forget the Prius, man. Anyways, who won?
Interesting. The winner of the painting is Jennifer Taylor.
Jennifer, congratulations.
Jennifer, congratulations. Thank you so much for supporting the show. And I'm going to get your address from you here soon, and I'm going to then send you the painting.
Yes. Yes.
Amazingness.
I will, first of all, I'll wipe it down with some holy water, smudge it with some sage, get a little potpourri up in there to make sure it smells nice and fresh. And thank you for your support, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. All right, Marie, we did it.
Part one
done. Let's get out of here.
Night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mad Scientist Pod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Because we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.